Hello, good evening. This is Kavidia Papalia. I'm with the California Association for the Deaf. I'm the CAD president. Welcome, everyone. This is our fourth webinar in our series, and the title of tonight's presentation is The New Four-Letter F Word, Why Just Fine is Not Okay. So I would like to set up some ground rules to get us started off here tonight. And how this is going to go tonight is there's going to be a presenter, and when they are done giving their presentation, we'll have a brief intermission, just a few seconds, to give the interpreters a moment to rest their voices and give the captioner a break here. And then we will have a Q&A. And Marla will be moderating our Q&A and will read questions out from our Facebook and from our YouTube. We'll be reading out audience questions so you can submit them in both of those places. If there are questions off the topic to what we're talking about tonight, we're not going to bring those up and discuss those during this webinar. If your questions are related, you can post them on Facebook or YouTube, and we will ask those questions of our presenter tonight. If anybody is bullying or being insulting or harassing, we will ask you to leave, or we will remove you from the Facebook or the YouTube live stream. All right, I'm thrilled to introduce Dr. Marla Hatrack, and she's going to be our moderator for this evening. Right, that's funny, I forgot. I just got my PhD. I'm not used to that. So thank you, Kavita, for introducing me. So yes, my name is Marla Hatrack, and I'm going to describe myself now. I'm blonde with my hair tied back. I have black glasses, earrings that are orange and black, a necklace, and then a gray blouse with a brown sweater. And then there's a bookshelf on my left and a map behind me. So I'm honored tonight to introduce Michelle Burke. She's here with us tonight to present. She has presented before during our 2020 EHDI symposium, and the title of that was Rethinking Audiological Deprivation. And you can go to our CAD website and you can see the proceedings still there. They're there on our website, so you can take a look at those. And we have our past proceedings all there from that symposium. So Dr. Burke moved to California from the East Coast in 1990. And then since then, Dr. Burke has been working with the Gallaudet Regional Center, the GURC, at Ohlone College, and then was working at San Francisco State University, and then joined CSD Fremont. And Dr. Burke got her PhD from University of Colorado Boulder, and her dissertation was focusing on how deaf mothers read to their deaf children. So now she's working as an early childhood educator and ECE principal, so an early childhood educator principal. So welcome, Dr. Burke. Thank you for joining us tonight. Thank you. So thank you, Marla. I'm going to describe myself as well first. I identify as female, and I have curly reddish hair. I'm wearing glasses. I have a dark blue blouse, and a small necklace. And my background is a solid color background. It's a gray or bluish color. And then I have a plant in the corner of that wall as well. So I'm thrilled to be here tonight because what I'm going to be talking about is new information, maybe, but maybe not new information. Really, it's a reframing of how we're thinking about the words that people use in education to talk about our children. So when I'm talking with a live audience, I usually ask questions about this four-letter F word. What could that be? But I can't see you all tonight, so I'm going to propose what my answer is, and that's fine. That is the four-letter F word. Fine is becoming problematic with using that word with children within the educational system, and I'm going to talk about why saying fine and having that approach is not okay. So back in 2012, it's not that long ago, but this is my perspective as a parent, right? So in 2012, I had a second grade child who had a mild hearing level. And we talked about it with the school. My husband and I, we said, well, our child needs support. And the answer that we got was no, they're doing fine. They didn't want to give any supporting services because they're fine. So our framework was that we were concerned, myself and my husband. But, you blink your eyes, and in 2019, I became a principal at the California School for the Deaf, the EDE. And there we have 18-month-old babies up until kindergartners, right? So that's our age range that we work with. And we see what happens when those children are 3. So they have an IEP, and what an IEP is a plan for their education, and that starts at 3 while they're in preschool. Where are we going to place them? Should they be placed in a preschool? Yes or no? And having those types of discussions. And when we do that, a lot of our families run into a barrier there because they're told the children are doing fine. And that's hard because we know that those children need ongoing language support. So those are the two frames that I bring, right? As a parent and as a professional as well. And before I go ahead any farther, I want to explain a little bit of my own background about who I am. I'm a hearing person. My family is deaf. My mother, my father, my grandparents, my aunts, uncles, cousins on both sides are deaf. My brother and sister are deaf. I have another brother and sister who are hearing, but I was raised as a bilingual person, right, with ASL and English. I'm married. My husband is deaf, and he was married previously and has 3 deaf daughters from that marriage. And so I have deaf kids, deaf grandkids, and we together have one child together. And that child is who we quote unquote called hard of hearing. And we'll talk tonight about why I'm saying quote unquote hard of hearing. So that's my personal experience, me growing up, being bilingual, seeing a world with a deaf family as being great, a great experience. And now I see as an educator the challenges that families are facing and the importance of communicating with them and letting them know that when a professional says just fine, that they can speak up and say, no, that's not okay. So when they say just fine and they'll be just fine and it's just fine, the message behind that phrasing is that it's okay for the child to fail first. We'll let the child fail and then we'll provide services and support services. And sometimes the messaging is focusing on a child's good ear, a child who maybe has deafness in one ear or a different hearing level in one ear versus the other. They'll focus in on this hearing ear, the quote unquote good ear. Or they'll say, well, they have a mild hearing loss, and that's fine. They still can hear well. And that's the framing that parents get. And they don't recognize then the risk and the potential for language deprivation. And the message also is saying that really it's ignoring that it's important for children, whatever their hearing level is, that they need a strong language foundation. And that is really critical for that kindergarten readiness. In California, we are very fortunate that people, including CAD, have really advocated for and passed the SB 210 bill. That bill forces schools and parents to really look at those language milestones, regardless of their spoken language or sign language, but to look at those language milestones and make sure those children are going to be ready for kindergarten. And again, when we say just fine, they can hear a little bit, and that's just fine. That comment really has a different message behind it. Is that a problem? Is that messaging problematic? That it's just fine? There's some ambiguity with definitions that I want to talk about tonight. So, this concept that I said earlier was hard of hearing. Well, let's think about that, right? Think about defining hard of hearing. What does that mean? Most definitions for hard of hearing from like the World Health Organization or from audiologists, they will frame hard of hearing as someone who really it could be any person who has a hearing loss and then ranging from mild to severe. And those who work with deaf people know that that is a huge range to label as one thing, as hard of hearing. So, who is defining that terminology? And in California, the people who define it are the people who are on the child's IEP team. That means teachers, parents, maybe a speech language pathologist. There could be a principal there, right? So the people on the IEP team are going to define hard of hearing. But then what are they basing that definition on? And what about the varieties within that group that we're thinking of, right? Do they have the same hearing level as someone else who's considered deaf? And then who made the distinction there that we're going to call one person hard of hearing and another person deaf? It's very ambiguous and it's not clear what that phrase means. Something else that's ambiguous in this is if we say the child is not fine, then we have to decide to give services. Are we going to give services with an IEP or through a 504? And each of those then have money attached to them. So when I'm talking about in 2012, when I had my meeting about my child, the school said, well, we don't have money if we need an interpreter or if we need an FM system, we don't have funding for that. And so that was one of the reasons they wanted to avoid that. They wanted to avoid an IEP or a 504 because of the funding related to that. And a new trend today within special education, there's a new buzzword, and that buzzword is inclusion. And the concept of inclusion is not new to us, right? We typically think about inclusion as mainstreaming, where a child who is labeled as having a disability is placed in a general education classroom. And right, it can be a good idea, it can be good for the child, it can be good for the class. Yes, I agree with that, but we have to think about inclusion for a deaf child. That means something different because we're talking about language access there. And I'm sure you've experienced being an only deaf person and being surrounded by hearing peers in a classroom. And they have comments and side conversations, people raise their hand. And then, as a deaf person within the rest of that hearing classroom, is that inclusion? Is that what inclusion looks like? It's a real challenge. And I would suggest that maybe for those deaf children, inclusion actually means language, a language rich environment, being with their peers, being with adults who they can communicate and understand with all of them directly. That's what that means. Being involved in after school activities, being able to be leaders, being able to participate in drama and sports and all of those extracurriculars. That is what inclusion means. So, what can we do? This is the system that we have now, right? Just fine. We're going to mainstream them, and that's inclusion. But what can we do about that? Well, we have to educate. In LA Unified School District, they just passed this new exclusion, this new opportunity for deaf students, and that's really inspiring. And all of those families deserve access to ASL as soon as those children are identified as deaf or as deaf and hard of hearing, right? So, really, we need to continue to support those families. And that I have a tool that I want to share with you, and we'll go ahead to the next slide and we'll talk about that. So this is a brochure developed by Dr. Rachel Friedman, NAR, and Dr. Rebecca Lewis. They developed this because they recognized that those who work in the field know that these children are still at risk, and we need something that we can give to families. So in California, we have a learning community where children who are deaf can get together and have a learning community on Zoom across the whole state. And so they developed this brochure for the California Department of Education to then give to families. And I'm going to explain to you what is on this brochure. So it explains what a mild hearing loss is, right? It has an audiologist's statement there about that. And remember, before I mentioned that phrase of hard of hearing, and that there's not a clear definition for what that is. It could be that 26 to 40, or it could be more severe of a hearing loss than that. But the point is, any hearing difference is still a possibility for a child being at risk. And we might think, or someone might think, that a mild hearing loss is not a risk, but we don't want people to have that perspective or to look at it in that way. So the impact is real. We all know that. There are so many deaf children who are left out of conversations. And this isn't a new thing. This has been happening for a long time, right? I'll tell you later. And that information in that incidental learning means that everybody else in the room is able to speak about something, and I don't have access to that as a deaf person, right? Even if a child is someone who can hear with a mild hearing loss or can hear from one ear, they're still going to miss information. And maybe sometimes they'll be looked at as lazy or a student who doesn't pay attention, or they're missing cues and they don't realize certain things, and everybody else stood up and now they're going to stand up. Like one simple example for me, I was observing my child. It must have been in first or second grade, and all the students were sitting on the floor and looking at the teacher. And the teacher was saying, well, now it's time to get up and put your right hand on your chest. And the flag was on the opposite side of the room. They were going to do the pledge. And so all of the kids got up and turned to the flag. And my child was sitting on the floor still. And maybe it's just 5 seconds or 10 seconds, but they looked up, they recognized that all the other kids had stood up and looked over at the corner, and they got up and did that as well, right? But that little missed thing was something that they missed from the teacher, and then they recognized from their peers. And that can be something that's common for deaf children, is recognizing that and then having to catch up with that cue, right? That recognition of, ooh, I know I missed something, and trying to catch up. So again, a mild hearing loss, maybe they have hearing loss in one ear, and that perspective of just fine, it's not correct. That it can impact their identity, it can impact their sense of belonging in a classroom. So another example I want to talk about is there was a child in an elementary school, and every year they have a tradition called May Day, which is a dance that they had at the school. So this is my child, who's wearing the blue shirt there, and the other child is his friend, and that's who's wearing the white shirt. So I'm a good mom. I reminded him before, what clothes are you going to wear tomorrow? What are you supposed to do? And he said, no, I'll pick a nice shirt. That's what I'm supposed to do. I said, okay, great. And then we showed up at school for this May Day event. And oh, all of the boys were wearing white shirts. My son, he identifies as male, and he was the only one of them who identifies as male who's wearing a blue shirt. And I said, I noticed all your friends are wearing white shirts. What happened? Do you know? And he said, well, the teacher said we can wear anything. And I thought maybe there was a cue there that he missed. And I approached the teacher later and I asked, what did you share with the students about what to wear for May Day? And his teacher shared that she talked about having boys wear white shirts. And so I knew that he'd heard wearing a nice shirt, and the teacher said a white shirt. So he misunderstood what he was hearing. And again, that's just one tiny example. Did that mess up his day? No, he was fine. But Over time, all of those little missed cues can really impact a child's social and emotional well being. And I know this slide is a little hard to see, but I'm going to talk some more about the impact, the impact on the quality of life for these children. Sometimes they might need extra support or extra attention in school. So, studies have shown that these mild hearing level children that they have maybe not a big group of friends. They just have a few close friends and that they struggle in those noisy environments. If it's out at recess or in the gym or in a cafeteria, it can be hard for them. These children often have an increase in behavioral issues. And as the children get older, they learn coping skills and recognize what they need. And maybe over time that will get better. But for some children, maybe it won't. And does that mean that that's on them? No, it doesn't mean that. So, again, thinking about that, what can we do? Some thoughts about what parents can do and some thoughts about what professionals can do is what we'll go over here. So, parents. Parents have to advocate, 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 advocate for your child. In California, again, we have SB 210. So, we recognize that, but it's really important to know those language milestones and to track your child's language milestones and to discuss those in every IFSP and IEP meeting. And as a parent, to recognize that maybe your child is missing something. And sometimes, does the child know that they've missed something? No, they don't have that concept that they're missing something yet. And then we need to empower this child to understand what their hearing level means. Sometimes I might miss some information. Okay. And then thinking about that, maybe I need to be more assertive to get the information and to get what I need. And one example, so talking about my child again, we know that the elementary school has health education. And in the back of my mind, I was thinking about they're going to talk about all these different parts of the body, vocabulary, and all of that. So we sat down and we read a book before. I want to know what he's going to be discussing in class and looking back. I'm really glad I did because we read this book together and the book talked about a woman's body part. And my son looked at it, at the book, and said, Mom, look at this. They spelled that word wrong. And the word that we were talking about there was vagina. And I said, Well, no, it's spelled correctly. How do you think it's spelled? And he said, I thought it's spelled with a B, Bagina. And I realized that's just something that, B and V sound very similar. And that was something, a missed opportunity. So thinking about that, what if we hadn't talked about that? And in class, he raised his hand and said, Oh, I know how to spell that and spell Bagina. That could impact him, right? Kids could make fun of him, things like that. Thinking about the impact that something like that could have. And as parents, we really need to support those children and make sure that we make all of this information explicit. Provide the child with the tools to self advocate, while we, of course, are advocating as well. And really, another thing is to recognize that extracurriculars are important as well for these children. So, what should professionals do? As professionals, we are accountable not to look at those children as just fine. Just fine. Fine is a four-letter word. Sometimes we need counseling, maybe if it's appropriate. Maybe we need to make sure that those students have those social and emotional learning tools. And we want to make sure that we're providing those and to be sensitive when communicating with the family and careful with the language that we use as professionals. Just fine. Just fine is not something that we should say. We should recognize when a family says they need an IEP or they need a 504, we should listen to that. And thinking about that, those hearing levels, mild or unilateral hearing loss, those children still need an IEP, an accommodation, but we need to recognize their hearing level and think about what that means. And that means that they're still at risk. And that means we're responsible to communicate that with the family. So that's my presentation. And that's why I hate that word fine. That fine is a four-letter word and it's not okay. So thank you everyone for watching tonight.
Hi. That was such a beautiful job, Michelle. I think we have a few questions. The first one says, you mentioned the LAUSD resolution. Do you think that that will have an impact and fewer professionals will say, oh, that student will be fine or that person will be just fine? That is my sincere hope. That's another four-letter word, hope. Because parents will be getting education. They will be getting the tools that they need right away. That will include information about hearing levels and also finding out that all of people with the hearing loss are at risk and we can provide tools. So yes, I do hope it will reduce that idea of, or the impact of losing children and losing time to language deprivation. It's funny, you just pulled up that handout. Someone asked a question is how they could get a hold of that pamphlet. The California Department of Education has it posted on their website. It's under the DHH unit, Deaf and Hard of Hearing unit. Right now, there's not a person positioned there, but if you contact, I guess you can look at my email. But there is also, I could send a link on where you could find it online. Marla said, maybe we could send that link out to all of the students who are registered. If you send that to us, we'll go ahead and send that out to everybody. Okay. The third question: do you support the idea of all hard of hearing students learning ASL? Yes, I do. I'm smiling, yes, but yes, I do. Because language is beautiful, and being bilingual is beautiful, and being trilingual or multilingual is beautiful. There are many reasons for a hard of hearing child to learn another language or to learn sign language. I can't think of any reason for them not to learn sign language. And when they're young, you don't necessarily know. Maybe they have a mild hearing loss now, but it could change over time. Many students do have a degenerative, right, a progressive loss. And so to have another language ready in their toolbox to support them throughout their lives, there's no harm. There's no research showing that bilingual children are at risk of having any trouble. So having access to both languages from the start is definitely preferred. Now, the Los Angeles Unified School District resolution will promote ASL and English, ASL and English exposure. What are the implications of that within the school system, and how is that going to actually impact the whole state of California from 0 to 3, and actually from 3 to the age of 22? I have a few different thoughts. First of all, LA Unified School District is the second largest school system in the United States. It's the largest in California. Often the California Department of Education, when they look at LAUSD, often that kind of that school district sets the standards for what should be happening in other districts. My hope is that the state, that this is a wake-up call. The California Department of Education does have special ed and deaf ed separately, but the message, I think, hasn't really gotten out there for LAUSD to actually make that stand. I think can be a model for the entire state of California. Second of all, in terms of an early start, I just had a conversation with one local school district. The conversation was about the idea of meeting deaf adults right away. And the school district commented, well, we will introduce the idea of ASL or deaf adults when that is appropriate. And my thought was, who decides when something is appropriate or not? If the hearing professional thinks that a mild or hearing loss is okay and the student will be fine, and those people are making the decision about when it's appropriate to introduce ASL or introduce a family to a deaf adult, there are so many flaws with that. So again, my hope is that what's happening in Los Angeles will actually impact California and the rest of the nation. When a family has a deaf or hard of hearing infant, we know they go through a process. If the first person that they met was a deaf adult who is able to drive, who is able to go to school, who is able to be a successful working adult, I think that will give these families a sense of relief. Oh, my child's going to be okay. I think ASL English bilingual curriculum, and including language coach, and including deaf adults to work with families from day one isn't just something that should be introduced when appropriate. It needs to be introduced. Now there's the Hands and Voices got a grant, FL3, and on the website there is a discussion about the importance of deaf adults being involved in every phase. So really what you're saying is in line with what they have on their website, and yet it's not necessarily being practiced yet. It's nice to see us to push. In my dissertation, I interviewed two program directors from the age programs that serve children from 0 to 3 and 3 to 5. And we did see the same kind of attitudes. And why we're not doing more of having deaf adults involved, I don't know why. Marla, I think it's because the gatekeepers, it's like you have to look at who are making those decisions, and those people aren't informed. That's the question that I think we all need to look at, is the system is flawed. We need to fix the system. Yes, there are two LA Times articles, right? There's one before and one after the vote, the Los Angeles School Board. Have you read them both? No, I haven't. Wow, there was a huge pushback from parents. So you haven't read it. It's not part of the question, but let me see. Are there any more questions here? Kavita, do you have any more questions from the Facebook or YouTube audiences? No? Okay. Any final comments then? Michelle, do you have any comments before we close? I really, truly appreciate the opportunity to have this conversation, both because of my personal experience and my professional experience. It is such a critical period, and the earliest that we can expose children to both languages is really important. Um, the University of Rochester and Boston University has a partnership with the California School for the Deaf. And we can see that should not be a surprise. I'm sure it's not a surprise to you, but the research shows that earlier is better. The earlier that we can expose students to sign language, the better off it is, to children to sign language. If students are exposed to sign language before the age of 3, their outcomes, their scores, their standardized scores, are on par with their hearing peers. So whether parents are proficient in sign language or not, but if the child is in an ASL English bilingual program before the age of 3, they have a higher chance of meeting expectations and performing at the level of their hearing peers. And again, for social and emotional implications, when you're looking at a child who's exposed to language from birth and they're exposed to American Sign Language in an early childhood education program, you will see that they score higher on self-esteem. They're able to resolve conflicts better. They perform better in their ability to negotiate with adults. They're stronger. And yes, it does make sense. I want to go back to the comment about incidental learning I spoke about during my presentation. If you're in an environment where you can see two adults discussing a conflict and moving through and to resolve the conflict, you see that, then you get in a conflict, you have some tools already. I remember seeing someone having a conflict and resolving it, instead of just see two people with angry faces having some conversation but no words to really understand what happened. And then later you see them come back together and smile at each other, but you have no idea how that happened. So again, making those processes explicit in a visually accessible way for these children, I think you can't lose. It's only going to make things better for children to be healthy and confident. Okay, so I don't think we have any more questions. I must thank you so much for bringing the perspective of a group of people that I think sometimes we hear that perspective, we see that perspective, and we might not see their needs. I want to thank you for bringing us kind of looking at deaf and hard of hearing people as these youth having needs that we can have tools to provide and that are important to provide. July 23rd, we will have another webinar. That one's going to be with Dr. Wyatt Hall, presenting on that dry discussion, right, about moving past the audiological deprivation. So thank you so much. I hope you have a wonderful Memorial Day weekend. If you have any questions or any issues, please do send us an email. Thank you so much again, Dr. Burke.